Okay, everyone's in? All right, I'm getting the high sign that we're all in and ready to go. And welcome to the Walt Whitman Birthplace Association inaugural Composers Meet Whitman series, with our lead-off guest presenter tonight being American composer, writer, and filmmaker, Daron Hagen. Welcome, Daron.
Thank you.
I am Cynthia Shore, the Executive Director of the Walt Whitman Birthplace Association. And on behalf of the Board of Trustees, I extend our welcome to those of us who are here and who are putting on the production. H. Paul Moon, filmmaker extraordinaire, who has orchestrated tonight's Zoom presentation and who will serve as MC in just a moment. I also welcome George Mallis, our digital photographer and composer archivist, and Gilda Lyons, who is with us virtually, and she is the co-composer and presenter of the piece that we'll be presenting shortly. I want to extend a gracious thank you and a shout out to the Joel Foundation, yes, the Billy Joel Foundation, which has generously funded tonight's program, along with 4 other music programs to come. So please watch our website, tune in for those programs and the other engaging programs that we have in the future on our website. And finally, I would like to thank Suffolk County and New York State Parks for the continued generous support, and especially, I would like to thank viewers like you, our audience tonight, who appreciate and support our programs. We depend on your generosity. So sit back and enjoy, and I'm handing the evening over to our MC, H. Paul Moon. Paul?
Now you can hear me, right?
There we go. Yay.
How funny. I'm a real tech geek, and then here I am on the classic Zoom faux pas, but there I went. And the irony was that I was just saying we got to do all those Zoom announcements about make sure that you're muted so that I don't have host control. So we'll kind of go through the evening making sure, but I'm going to monitor the chat section. So if you can send me notes about things that are not working, let me know. The first advice I have is I also don't know as non-host how this works, but I think you can go to the top right to the view drop-down menu where there's a time counter and go to speaker mode. That might be something you might want to do, especially as we present a couple of things this evening. So at your option, you could do that to be able to see things in bigger size as the evening progresses. So I've just done that myself. And sometimes what happens is you can see a little grid of it, like the first few participants. But the next thing I want to do is actually really exciting. I'm excited to show this to you, and it's a great way for us to formally launch the Walt Whitman Music Archive, because what I've done is I've worked with composer Daron Hagen, tonight's featured guest, to create a 4-minute video that is actually premiering also tonight at the new home, the work in progress new home for the Walt Whitman Music Archive. Simply put, waltwhitman.org/music. And that video will contain both the 2 things we have to look forward to this evening video-wise, this 4-minute introduction to the archive. And then at the end of the final video that's on the website now and on the YouTube channel, also this world premiere performance by Gilda Lyons of the piece composed for this occasion by tonight's featured guests, Daron Hagen and Gilda Lyons. We'll play that piece, though, actually at the end of the evening to wrap things up. So for the next 4 minutes, please enjoy while I slowly but surely get my share screen working of that sort of documentary style introduction. Here we go.
Welcome to the Walt Whitman Music Circle. It's brought to you by the Walt Whitman Birthplace. I'm Daron Hagen. I'm a composer who, like so many others, has set a good deal of Walt's, I almost said music, but his words, so much of his poetry to music. In a moment, Gilda Lyons, composer and singer, will perform in this space a new work that we wrote together for this occasion. I'm sitting right now where the choir sits when they sing together here in the beautiful Church of the Messiah in Rhinebeck, New York. a chorus of voices singing in counterpoint, filling a communal space with shared beauty. A union of unique voices which somehow, through solidarity and love, coalesce into a democratic whole. It's Whitman, of course. It's his American salute. A composer, I write for multitudes. A poet, Whitman contained them. Is there a more musical American poet than Whitman? 17 of his poems begin with the word song. More of his poems have inspired settings by American composers than any other American poet, save Emily Dickinson. His singing voice, it marries the lyricism of bel canto and the rat-a-tat-tat of turn-of-the-century America. Art song, parlor music, gains a muscularity and a virility when it's paired to his words. Symphonic and choral music, large, public, grand by nature, is humanized, softened, made more intimate. The Walt Whitman Birthplace is proud to open a new collection and a new series of musical events. A generous donation by San Francisco-based Whitman enthusiast and musician Frederick Berndt forms the core of the collection. Working from a list of 490 names, Berndt painstakingly accumulated hundreds of published and unpublished settings of Whitman by American, British, and Germanic composers. By the time of his death in 1995, he'd amassed over 320 composers' works. British composers from Stanford to Holst, Americans from Blitzstein to Crumb, Germans from Weill to Hartmann, some not yet performed. The Berndt collection is now organized and welcomes scholars, performers, and the general public. The collection continues to grow and evolve. Digital house artist George Mallis continues to add to it recordings of Whitman-inspired works and photographs of the composers. Composers and their works continue to be added to Berndt's list. The collection invites composers to add their works to the collection to help grow what is probably the largest specialized Walt Whitman music collection in existence.
I'm going to turn it over now to George, who is at the Birthplace Archive itself, sitting in front of the stacks, and has a few examples, and also is just going to give a brief introduction to the archive from his view. George?
Welcome everyone. So glad to have you aboard. Come on in to the Walt Whitman Music Library. I am absolutely thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled that we have this collection that enables me to be here. There were several attempts in the past to start a music division here for one reason or another. None of them really came to fruition, including some efforts of my own in the past. But I certainly would like to thank our executive director, Cynthia Shore. Without her support and for this project, this never would have gotten off the ground. But being that music is such an important factor in understanding the totality of Whitman's achievement, thank God we have this now, because it gives us a more complete picture. As Daron mentioned, the heart of our collection really is the Berndt Library collection. And this consists of scores of either settings of Whitman verse or instrumental works that were inspired by Whitman. Berndt originally, he worked from a master list of, as mentioned, 490 names. I couldn't say for sure how he obtained all 490 names, but then he proceeded to contact composers to obtain the scores. Also adding bound scores of well-known works that were issued by established music publishers, or he obtained photocopies of manuscript scores from lesser-known composers. Many of these works have never been recorded, not in his lifetime, and still haven't been recorded. Many of them have never even received a performance during Bernst's years or up to the present time. By the time Bernt had to cease activities in 1993, as a result of a serious automobile accident, he had accumulated works by some 320 composers, and he did pass away in 1995. I'm going to show you some of the scores, some of the examples. Here's an example of a published bound score that he obtained, C Symphony of Ralph Vaughan Williams, which is certainly among the masterpieces of Whitman's settings. Another score that Bernt obtained is the Elegiac Ode of Charles Villiers Stanford. Notice that this is from 18, maybe glasses for this, 1884. Today, you don't see much decorative artwork on scores. They're pretty plain. But in those days, you know, this was the 19th century and everything was highly ornamented. It's really a beautiful score. President Lincoln's burial hymn. And that shows a little more clearly. It's repeated on the inside also. And one of the more interesting pieces, this is typical of what Bernt did. He would actually, he worked from paste ups that he would make and make photocopies, and then would have them spiral bound like this for distribution. Also on the inside has some of the original artwork. This is pretty much the earliest setting that I'm aware of a Whitman poem, 1880. Frederick Louis Ritter. Now, Ritter's wife had written to Walt asking permission to write this setting, to utilize his verse. And Walt wrote back, "Dear Mrs. Ritter, I cheerfully consent to professors using the words of two veterans for musical publication, and also give permission for further musical adaptation of my pieces. I'm curious to see how they go. I'm sure I should be impressed and pleased. My Western trip has worked well. My health is about the same as of late years." So Walt was quite enthusiastic to have his first set of music. He had a keen ear for music. Walt served as a music critic during his days as editor of the Brooklyn Eagle, and was quite on top of the music scene in New York, and was an avid devotee of the opera, particularly bel canto Italian opera, which was definitely an influence on his style. Now this is typical of how Bernt operated, what he did. He would send out a letter. This is an answer to one of his inquiries, written by a composer, Marshall Bielowski. So he posed each composer, he posed 7 questions: the name, where they were born, date they were born, when the work was written, whether it was performed or not, and the duration of the work. And it concludes here. This Marshall Bielowski's answer concludes, "Thank you for your order and all best wishes on your book." Well, that book unfortunately never came to fruition because Bernd did pass away. This letter was dated 1988. And he passed away a few years later.
Well, George, so
Yes.
if we can kind of come back to that after this introduction and talk a little more later about some of the other things, but I see you have CDs in front of you and then a few photographs to kind of wrap up the introduction to the archive.
Okay, sure. This was put together by myself over an extended period of time. As I discovered works myself, I purchased them and donated them to the museum. Hopefully, one day we'll get a chance to use this on regular meetings of the Walt Whitman Music Circle, when that comes to pass. I also have I should mention that the list that I've been working on here now is contains the 320 or so scores that Burns had accumulated. Plus, I've added about 70 more, bringing it up to date. Works that were, in some cases, by some composers who weren't even born yet at the time of Burns' passing. The other thing I'd like to show you is I've been putting together a collection of photographs of composers. This is I have here. This is the American Howard Hanson, Roy Harris, Frederick Delius, one of my favorite photographs. Ray Vaughan Williams, an American composer who's all but forgotten today, but wrote some gorgeous orchestral interpretations of Whitman verse. This is Frederick Shepard Converse. Here's Kurt Weill, actually in performance of Weill's Whitman songs with the tenor William Horn accompanying him.
Well, thank you so much, George, for the introduction to some of the things in the archive. And I know that you've put a lot of work into it. So I really hope that we have a great discussion this evening. I thank you all for coming. And I also want to make this as engaging and certainly interactive at the end. But if things come up along the way, we're going to monitor chat. And but if you want to take notes or write into chat, after the world premiere film of the world premiere performance at the end, we will certainly open it up and have an interesting discussion with all of you, which I really look forward to. But I just thought I'd launch into, I mean, Daron knows I love dissecting composers, and this is an evening where it'll be particularly enjoyable to dissect Daron's opinions and thoughts on Whitman and music. But I imagine that it could begin with just saying the typical sort of, how do I say this right? It's not always like Dead Poets Society, the romanticized idea that there's a moment of awakening when a composer, an artist, anybody, any of us sort of awakens to the poetry of Walt Whitman. But I thought I'd offer anyways the question to Daron about that sort of, what's the genesis of his interest in Walt Whitman, dating back to his early days as an artist.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks to everyone who came. I'm just thrilled to see a number of former pupils and a lot of colleagues and friends and everyone who so believes in the mission of the Walt Whitman birthplace. I'm thrilled to be here and thrilled to be able to have Gilda and my piece be a blessing to the opening of this set of webcasts or whatever we're calling them. It's a nice question. I suppose everybody who sets words to music remembers when they first read the poetry of Walt Whitman. My mother was a writer, and so I fumbled about with her books from the earliest memories I have. Of course, Leaves of Grass, with all of those luxuriant long sentences, really drew my attention as a preteen. But I didn't seriously set Walt Whitman to music until I arrived in Philadelphia. And I have a little note here to myself. I started studying with composer Ned Rorem, who of course has set so much Walt Whitman so beautifully and so tellingly, in the fall of 1981. And I've got a note here that says in October of 81, he assigned me Youth, Day, Old Age, and Night to set, because at that time we had a tradition, a rhythm together of him assigning me a poem that he had set to music, so that he could compare what I did with what he did, and hopefully I would do something contrasting. So that was the first Whitman poem that I set for him in 81. And when I decided what to offer this event, I returned to that poem 41 years later with Gilda, and set it in another very contrasting way. So I've known Whitman's poetry since my early preteens, and probably set maybe an hour and a half worth of it to music from almost all of the books. And much of the early settings that I did in the 80s were assigned by Ned, and they were things that he set to music. As it happened back then, because I think my publisher sort of fancied that I would be a vocal composer, most of those things were published very early on, and so they're in libraries, and so they're remembered in a way that things aren't remembered in the same way now that publishing sort of consists of being digitized.
Thanks, Daron. In fact, I hope you're okay with this, but I did find a recording of that very brief piece you mentioned. That is also the source for the new work that you returned to. So here's a performance, and since it's really short, it'll just be about a minute or so. I'm going to go ahead and share the video of just a typical recital performance that someone has performed of that particular work. And here we go.
Oh, I have to say something about that. He's a marvelous singer. That's a really nice performance. But it reflects two things Ned Rorem said to me that the first month I studied with him. First of all, take all of the notes off the downbeat, which is why it's a waltz without any downbeats in it, which I still tell my students 40 years later. And the second thing was a bit of advice to end. I went, and restoring darkness, the way that a young man ends a song up, but he said it's dark and down and dark. And so it makes the song when the man reaches down and goes into the dark part of his instrument. What a terrific composer. What Ned.
And we'll talk a little more about Ned in a few moments, but I thought I'd ask you first, so we start talking about the broad subject of Walt Whitman in music. I was intrigued by something you mentioned, and whether or not numerically it's exactly it. In the introduction video, one of the things you say is that Whitman's poetry might be used by more American composers than any other, save Emily Dickinson. And so, not to go deep into Emily Dickinson or the differences, but I am intrigued to know what you think of that. Essentially, that there is another poet that had perhaps musical qualities, certainly great fame, widespread understanding, and so on. But what type of composer might be drawn to Walt Whitman? What other type of composer might be drawn to Emily Dickinson? They do have different personalities. They might have different musical qualities implicit in the styles that they use to write their poetry. What do you think, Daron?
Well, I think that it would sound very flippant if I said that one of the reasons Walt Whitman is set so often is because his work is in the public domain. And I don't mean that in a flippant way at all. The same pertains to Dickinson, as long as you don't use, the Yale edition or something like that. So young composers are often encouraged, have been for decades, to set Whitman because of that. It's very hard to get the rights to things. But that's okay. So there's the ridiculous answer, and I suppose the sublime answer would be Whitman is great to set because there's a lot of commas, there are a lot of action words, there are a lot of descriptors, and there is always an effusiveness of expression. When you mentioned earlier that he liked bel canto, there's always a singing quality to what he does, and always really a profound rhythm. The other thing you can do with Whitman, I've had this conversation at various artist retreats and so forth over the decades with other composers about setting Whitman, is that you can cut Whitman up as a composer, and you can repeat and drop things in a way that there's a generosity, I'm not going to say verbosity, but there's a generosity of expression that yields to pruning. And composers really need that. So he's sort of like a great librettist who always says yes.
So interesting. Another sort of way to mark Whitman's influence and fame, even in his own time and then after his time, was the way that composers outside of the United States also very shortly began adapting his music, which is kind of striking when you think about it. It's almost like carbon dating a composer, a poet's legacy, to see what other artists consider the poet so great that it requires to be set to music. So what does that say, though, about other countries at that time? If we could put our heads back in that period of history, what is it about Whitman's poetry that seemed to particularly attract those composers outside of the United States? I mean, historically, I think Daron I would say, as an American composer, that it's sort of hard to be taken seriously by the rest of the world, because even lingering to today, maybe American composers are expected to represent the niches that America created and dare not, go onto the turf of the great European composers and the styles that they wrote in. So I'm curious, Daron, if you have some insights into this interesting, early, quick, international musical interest in Walt Whitman's poetry, and maybe give us some examples too.
Well, I wish that I could say that I were a Whitman musical scholar. I know an awful lot of living and recently passed away composers who have set Whitman, who are Americans and Europeans. I would tap a scholar for a really good answer to that question. But I will say that when I do speak to composers who are working abroad, whose teachers or who themselves have set Whitman, they always reach for his innate Americanness or whatever is perceived to be part of the self-written American narrative. He himself says that he sings of being an American. So when you're abroad reading Whitman, it's very hard to avoid Whitman and Twain. Samuel Clemens, both journalists as well. The press always traveled to Europe, particularly before the turn of the century, in a way that American literature sometimes didn't. And so he was there. He was in the newspaper all the time. Anyway, that's not a very good answer to your question, but I will say that there is an innate Americanness, at least part of the image that was being built by people at a time when nationalism was considered a responsibility, a patriotic duty.
That's so interesting. And in fact, it resonates with a comment in chat that Margaret Gardy made. And she was talking about wartime being a frequent influence or inspiration for composers. I'm thinking also one of my favorite composers to have set Whitman is Ralph Vaughan Williams, and George mentioned the Sea Symphony, but Vaughan Williams was inspired by a lot of wartime subjects. And that goes to also the international, and how do I say, universal quality of what Whitman wrote. I mean, this democracy that Whitman celebrated certainly also expanded beyond the borders of maybe conventional thought. So when I think of Vaughan Williams, Daron, I also think of it's a word that's kind of easily too broad maybe, but mysticism. And Vaughan Williams found in Walt Whitman a sort of mysticism that inspired in turn the composition. So there you also have the relationship between, spiritual, religious music history and the new doors that might have opened through Walt Whitman's poetry to fit that religious tradition into musical form with words.
Well,
Any insights on that, Daron?
Well, I will say that I am awfully I care very deeply about the fact that Whitman was not a transcendentalist per se, but was a spiritual seeker. And I think maybe what you're reaching toward is the fact that so many people of so many different organized religions respond to Whitman because he's utterly non-judgmental, without strictly speaking, towing a secular humanist line. He is reaching towards something that is not magical but mystical, and I think that that's very important, particularly in times of great strife. You mentioned so much war poetry, so much of his war writing has been a source of solace and repentance and witnessing on the part of American composers. I think possibly the greatest piece that Ned Rorem has ever written was War Scenes. John Adams' Wound Dresser is a magnificent work. Jennifer Higdon's Dooryard Bloomed is a marvelous, marvelous work. There's something about Whitman's capacity for allowing people to be elegiac in a non-dogmatic fashion. That maybe that's what you were reaching toward, Paul. I'm not sure.
Sure. And let's get to know, I just thought I'd proceed now to explore a little bit more about Walt Whitman and his own interest in music that we could maybe see traces of in the writing. I mean, certainly during the introduction video, Daron, I loved how you mentioned that even statistics, like how many of his poems begin with the word song. Mm-hmm. And then furthermore, you've already said some very eloquent insights about how the poetry itself sort of sings with music. But I'm going to present a screen that will be one of those share screens again, but it's just a static image. It'll look really wordy. It's a lot of text, but I thought I'd just leave it all up there. And then Daron, you and I can go over this. But to be honest, I think to keep it easy, I think Daron, I'd love for you to we'll go bullet by bullet. And I'd love for you to comment on any of these things. What I've just done is I've scrounged together through the research of a Whitman scholar named Robert Strasberg, some quotes, some fun nuggets
Oh, neat.
of insight that Whitman has said about music. So you see a very complicated, interesting, quirky side of Walt Whitman's views on music. Lots of words there. So as to the first bullet, basically what you have is, at first, Whitman in youth wasn't quite resonating with operatic excess. And so you see him complaining about, quote, the trills, the agonized squalls, the lackadaisical drawlings, the sharp, ear-piercing shrieks, the gurgling death rattles. So you have a young Walt Whitman sort of a little too cool for operatic melodrama, maybe. But then some observed that later in life, and then this was, we'll talk a little more about his actual behavior of patronizing music, that the dramatic overtures, the passionate cantabile arias, the eloquent sobbing recitatives were among the shaping forces of his free verse style of poetry. I mean, Daron, is there a sort of a time and place for opera? Because opera is one of the central mediums that you work in. And I think I asked you this, I think about a month ago, like, when is the time for a composer to go to opera? And is it the same trajectory of a poet finding that?
Well, I just have a hot take on the first one. I think that's wonderful. I say the trills, the agonized squalls. What's the problem? That's what opera does. That's why we go to the opera, to stand on our hind legs and howl. And I think that is the very thing that Whitman, in his soul, was vibrating in harmony with. So I don't know. Maybe I don't think he's complaining. I think he's thrilled that it's doing all of that. So that's my hot take.
Yeah, and I think, the writer has put his spin on it, saying that it's a complaint, but indeed, maybe it was sort of like a indulgent fun that eventually did find its way into his poetry, because very soon,
opera is we forget, or for some reason, that opera is a vulgar affair, and it should be vulgar. There's a reason Carmen is an opera, and there's a reason we go to it. We don't go to the opera to keep a stiff upper lip. We go to cry. We go to be taken outside of ourselves. All of the magical transference and transformation that is possible in the theater happens writ large in opera. And I think that's the dramatic overtures, all of this kind of stuff, of course, was a shaping force. I think that he saw imagine what kind of librettist he would have been. Probably would have written too much and would have needed a stage director to maybe work with him, but they would have been fantastic libretti.
And with the second bullet, you can read it yourself. Everybody could read it yourself, because it's just simply him not only clearly being moved by the experience of listening to a soprano's voice, but also you're seeing him really start hearing singing in a new way. He's already inclined to connect what he hears at the opera house to what, as he calls, the gyrations of a bird in the air. The word
that jumps out at me here in this one is the word appalled, which has a sort of a puritanical guiltiness to it, which I adore, because you should feel somewhat soiled when you go to the opera if it's done right. And I think, again, what's the problem? I think that he was quite, but there is in American culture, of course, such a schism between so-called art music and popular music and high, medium, and low culture. This is one wonders how Whitman would feel about culture now, American culture now, in its magnificent multiplicity. What is high class is appalling in a way. in the best possible way.
I do want to explore that more this evening, because I think we'll get to as a large subject that the archive represents a particular type of musical expression.
Yes.
But as to what he was experiencing in his day, the next bullet I think is him really declaring, self-diagnosing, confessing how there is this fine line that what he heard, he's saying rather dramatically, gave the foundation to all of his poetic literary efforts. And he says, were it not for opera, I could never have written Leaves of Grass. I mean, what a statement. I mean, do you buy that, Daron?
I think that it's remarkably generous for him as an artist to say that. And I suppose typically generous of Whitman. I don't know what opera is. I think that opera is whatever you say it is, just like a symphony is whatever you say it is. If you can pull it off, it is what it is. I think that what I respond to here is that he's listening critically, and that he understands that there's a sister art that does the same thing that he does, though he's not claiming his own melodies the way that many poets do. Let me try to be more precise, or at least understandable or coherent. One of the things that I've learned over the years working with living poets who have written their words before, not as lyricists, but as poets, they've written a poem that I have then set to music and performed it for them. They inevitably have their own music in mind. And one of the things that I remember, George Crumb recently passed away. I remember talking to him at a party in Philadelphia where I said, I'm studying with Ned Rorem, who never repeats words. And Crumb looked at me with this look of sort of amazed befuddlement on his face, because that was something that he couldn't imagine not doing, because of the glorious examination of the sounds of the letters in the word, the chewiness of it, the examination of the pure sounds. Inevitably, most poets understand that a composer is an uninvited guest to the party when they set their words to music. And I'm not trying to be clever. It's just really true. The poem existed before the composer came along, and what business does the composer have recontextualizing it? As such, that's why I come out to say that he's being remarkably generous by saying what he's saying. There's no real reason why a composer should set an already published set of words to music, except to disagree with them, because you have to have a problem with the words as they are. You can't just love them so much you want to give them flowers. There's no reason to set them to music if you love them all by themselves. So it's an interesting thing. He's not being critical of composers the way that composers are being critical of him.
And that celebration of everyone seems consistent with this fourth comment that he has about the human voice being a divine instrument, that there's nothing greater than the human voice. He calls it the great combiner. Nothing is more spiritual than the human voice, more sensuous. It's a God yet completely human, playing with these interesting boundaries in both spiritual and artistic realms. But Daron, I'm dying to know if you have any kind of reaction to his actually somewhat judgmental last comment here. And basically what he seems to be doing is, on the other hand, this is something that probably you're acquainted with, Daron. You have that tussle between the librettist of this, in this case, a theoretical opera. I think what you're seeing is Walt Whitman saying, if I wrote an opera, this is the way it should go. And what he's saying is keep the music playing most of the time without all the messiness of the human voice, but at the same time, keep it focused on the story. And so there's an interesting judgment about the balance that plays out. Let me maybe put it another way, Daron. how do you negotiate that interesting, delicate balance between the sort of weird way that opera sometimes when we go, we feel like, do they have to be singing all the time? Can they give us a break? Could this just be an ambient experience rather than just this busyness of constant singing all the time? Any thoughts?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, and nobody has enough time to sit and listen to me talk about that for an hour. But I mean, there's a lot to unpack. I will say two things though. First, I've never met a librettist or a poet who didn't feel like that, and I can't even start. But what I will do is talk about how in Benjamin Britten's opera Billy Budd, possibly the most vital, most moving, most sublime stretch in that opera, based of course on Melville's novella, is the sequence of chords without a melody, without counterpoint, just a sequence of chords that are played by the orchestra when Captain Vere leaves the stage to go into his stateroom to inform Billy Budd that he will have to be hanged. And I remember I first heard it when I was 13. My brother Kevin brought the LPs home. And here you have Peter Pear's ringing voice. It's my job to tell him, what am I going to say to him? Britten sets it all up with Forster. What am I going to say to him? How can I say him? How can I tell him that I know he's this, that, and the other thing? All the Melvillian things, all of the Judeo-Christian things going on. He tells us what's going to go on in the next 2 minutes or so. And then nothing but a sequence of chords that transfix everything. They tell the entire story. It's, besides being a theatrical coup, it's also a profound insight into the power of music to convey narrative in a way that is so abstract as to climb directly into the lizard brain of the listener, past their critical faculties. It's the reason I became a composer instead of a writer. It's because you can speak truth to power. You can be a citizen, a musical citizen. You can fight for the things you care to fight for in words that are so compelling that they're not words. You use music to speak truth to power. That's why people become composers who can write. And writers who can't compose are absolutely to be excused for feeling that music's getting in the way of their words. In many ways, most of the composers I know feel that words are too easily mangled, too easily mismanaged, too easily twisted in order to make a point that is diametrically opposed to what the writer intended. That the writing scares the dickens out of me. And when I wrote a memoir, first thing that happened was that people who wanted to see an evil person saw an evil person. Anybody who wants to see a saint sees a saint. And that was an important learning experience for me. And it was an important reaffirmation of why I became a composer instead of a writer as a teenager. That's a long unpacking, but I can't even get into the other stuff. That's just writers and composers fighting about what comes first, the words or the music.
I did want to spend a couple minutes going through a couple of examples that I know that you're fond of, and you introduced Ned Rorem, but it'd be great to just actually hear something of his. And it turns out one of the pieces is just a nice short 1-minute piece. So we're going to play that and then I'd love to hear your personal testimony as to your thoughts on this particular piece. So here comes that.
Stranger, if you passing meet me and desire to speak to me, why should you not speak to me? And why should I not speak to
What did we just hear, Darren?
A little gem. You know, it's a he signed me this to set to music as well, and I said it twice for that lesson in two contrasting ways. One, a la Ives, with two people who had probably been to Vienna and visited Freud, so it's very oh stranger, and the other very sweet and beguiling, like two children meeting each other in a state of grace. Ned's, of course, is filled with exquisite bourgeois sophistication and elegance and grace. The wonderful thing for me about his hearing that is that it has a sense of place and time. Ned brings to it a sensibility, an understanding of a sunny day in Brooklyn, and possibly flirting as you walk down the street. There's doesn't get any better than that.
And would you say actually that Ned is maybe arguably the most prolific, or by count, or at least by a reputation, maybe America's or the world's foremost major composer who has tackled Walt Whitman?
I don't know, but I will say that War Scenes, he wrote it in '69 as a serious anti-war statement, as a Quaker and pacifist, something that I think took a little bit of nerve in 1969, a piece that is still possibly his finest piece. I've set Look Down, Fair Moon, I've set Specimen Case, and mine aren't as good as his, but the words are just so magnetic and so devastating that I think he gets as close to what he once in an essay wrote. He says that music can't make people march away from war the way that it can be used to march people to war, but perhaps a piece like War Scenes manages to do that somehow.
Another work that you've commended that definitely has a lot going on beneath the surface is from Leonard Bernstein's Songfest, and he adapted to what you said. I'm going to skip around a little bit to get to the meat of it, but this is from a live performance. The video quality is pretty bad. We're on Zoom, so so it goes. But this will be a live concert with Bernstein conducting.
Clasping my hand, this is my answer. Though you have strayed hither for my sake, you can never belong to me, nor I to you. Behold the customary loves and friendships, the cold gods. I am that rough and simple person. I am he who kisses his comrade lightly on the lips at parting, and I am one who is kissed in return. I introduce that new American salute. Behold, love choked, correct, polite, always suspicious. the palace, what are they to me? What to these young men that travel with me?
It goes on, but Daron, I wonder if that's more than just about one thing.
Oh, of course. I mean, it's, I just, it was so nice to see, of course, LB, but to see Robert Osborne. I produced a CD years later in New York somewhere, of him doing, gosh, I'm sorry, I'm a little befuddled. It's a very moving song. Seaward, big song album, but Bob never sounded better. Sorry, I'm a little. Yes, it's about a lot, that song, and for LB to write that in 1976, again, some courage involved, but also to bring it to the Kennedy Center, to do what he did, the way that he did with Mass, for example. You can feel however you want to. You can know what you know. You can don't know what you don't know. It's a devastating take on what was then, I guess, recently uncovered or unpublished or something poem of Whitman's, obviously about sexuality, but I think just about the repression of any sort of spirit, the snuffing out of life by darkness and death, and how all good souls, how all responsible people must fight that. He, Bernstein does a lot of really smart stuff in that. I mean, the idea of flattening the voice out on a monotone like that denudes the singer of expressivity, the way that he's denuded of his sensuality and all of these wonderful text painting things, but also the idea of pedal points, of the underpinning of society, how I mean, I don't have to do dime store analysis for you. It's just a masterful display, and sort of the emotional emotional driver behind all of Songfest. It's the nuclear reactor that drives that entire song cycle. It's a magnificent song cycle, but that setting in particular is something that anybody who doesn't know it can be devastated by it. I've heard it sung in churches on Easter, and it's something that I'm hearing more often as offerings at Easter, which is a very interesting read.
Another composer, I don't have an excerpt because it's a really long piece. It's a very long form piece. I think it might have been my first encounter with Whitman in music because it was really popular when I was growing up. A major early work of John Adams, and worth mentioning also because he just had his 75th birthday, I think about a week ago. So a lot of people are looking back on the works of John Adams. Mm-hmm. Some call him the greatest, he's volleying for maybe greatest living American composer. But this early work of his was an adaptation of what used to be called The Dresser and became The Wound Dresser, and a Civil War poem. It's a long form orchestra and soloist work that has a very large sound to it, but also a very hushed sound to it. Daron, do you recall hearing that first? And where do you actually, if you want to, composers analyzing composers, where do you place that in Adam's body of work?
I think that he really got it right with that piece. I think he was the right fellow at the right time to do that particular setting. Since we were speaking of Ned, I recall that Ned was piqued by it because he too had set much of that text. If composers can feel a sense of ownership of another artist, that Ned sort of felt, I guess, ownership of Whitman. I don't know if John Adams is the greatest living American composer. I don't think it's appropriate for us to talk about things like that. How about John Adams? How about John Williams? You know, how about somebody we've never heard of? I think that the greatest American composer is working in a digital audio workstation, writing music that maybe nobody's even hearing, and they are unable to notate. And that you alluded to this earlier. The reason that Wound Dresser is such a moving piece is not because it's classy or it gets done in concert halls, but because there's a Catholicism to it. As it's not, I don't mean that religiously. There's a generosity of spirit to the Wound Dresser, which is buttressed by some good formal bones musically. But it's really, I bridle when I hear about greatest composer things.
Sure. Also, to another timely composer to mention is George Crumb, who just
Yes.
passed away.
Yes.
And one of his works is called Apparition. I'll show you a brief clip from the first movement of a live performance, but you will see something that I wanted to talk to you next about, Daron, which is that if George Crumb was not only pushing the boundaries with regard to tonality and structure and notation, you also start to think not necessarily of the need for composers to incorporate Whitman's poetry to be sung, but maybe to be expressed in not necessarily just a singing way. And so we can see the beginnings of that in this interesting work.
nestling close to thee. Nestling close to thee.
You mentioned meeting George Crumb. So, Daron, now that he's passed and we're reflecting on his life, how about this? Why do you think that he chose Whitman? And what do you think about Whitman might have resonated with this composer who we don't necessarily easily associate with the feels of Walt Whitman's poetry?
Well, apologizing for my senior moment, or I was verklempt after the Bernstein. It was at Town Hall, and Bob Osborne was making an all Henry Cowell CD. Phew. Okay, so you should all listen to it. It's a great, wonderful singer, and Cowell's a great composer. As was Mr. Crumb. I didn't study with Mr. Crumb. I don't have a right to call him George. I knew his music the way that every single serious, relatively intellectually hungry American composer who lived between the 60s and the aughts had to. I even went through my Crumb period the way that so many composers do, because it's impossible not to hear a George Crumb piece and not get sucked into his beautiful sound space. I think that this particular excerpt is a nice excerpt. It's sort of ululation, sort of a modal thing. The Crumb that I love the most is when he's brutal and when he takes the sounds of poetry and slices and dices them and pulls them apart and reconfigures them. This is much dreamier and sort of not, to me, the strongest. But what would appeal to Mr. Crumb? I suppose the same thing that drew him to Lorca. There are amazing similarities between Lorca and Whitman. And I just put that out there as my understanding of it.
I also, I think it could lead into also when it comes to the scope of a music archive and how to define composers who have set Whitman. Another another valid part of that would be if somebody is asked to speak poetry as recitation alongside music. And so George Mallis held up that score to Ritter's A Dirge for Two Veterans. And from what I could tell, that was not a singing adaptation of Whitman's poetry, but rather it was a recitation of something alongside performed music.
Well, you put your finger on something very interesting. Two things that are very interesting. I'll start with the easy one first. The easy one is melodrama, the idea of pieces for narrator and orchestra. I think of Lincoln Portrait. I think of a performance of Lincoln Portrait that I heard shortly after 9/11. And another one shortly after the inauguration of the former guy. I think of the power of those moments of spoken word juxtaposed with with an orchestra, with music. I find them to be very, very powerful. And I find the conceit in opera, for example, of making the bad guy the fellow who doesn't sing a very interesting one. The ability to, the minute that you make an evil character sing, they become humanized. And that's another key, I think, to Whitman. Okay, but the second part is tougher. And that is what constitutes setting poetry to music. I think that what Ned does and what I did for many, many years is very, very narrow slice of what constitutes musicalization and recontextualization of text. I'm now doing very different things to text. And the thing that we're going to hear coming up that I co-composed with Gilda Lyons is juxtaposes, for example, a line of sung Whitman that has been set one way and then examines the various sounds and uses overtones and so forth to examine the sounds of the melody and the psychological ramifications of that fragment of text in a way that I think is what composers who don't really have an orchestral tradition to lean on, or a fancy education at a big deal conservatory to call their roots, what they are using to confront these texts. I'm thinking of people who are self-taught, who start in Compton, people who create around themselves ateliers of people, all of whom do the jobs that they themselves couldn't afford to go to school to learn or didn't see the point of learning because there's technology for that. And nobody ever told them that you don't repeat words or that this is high class or low class. Those are the settings of Whitman that possibly might fascinate him the most and possibly might engage him the most at this point. I'd like to think so.
Yeah, and let's expand on what you're introducing there, which is the idea of different genres of music and different types of people and different identities and so on, because I think there's a way to explain, for example, why let's focusing on this music archive, the names that show up in the music archive and what musical traditions they come from. I mean, when you compose music, there's a few things in play. There's a publisher who has a stake in printing the music. It has to be notated for other people to play it the same way it was composed originally. And so that's the reason why an archive will tend to contain things that are what is conventionally called classical music. And it's funny, the classical music is a category that continues to this day to define composers who are writing music right now. It's still in the classical genre. But it's an interesting topic to chew on because it does effectively exclude the many other types of music that have adapted Walt Whitman, including folk music. So, I mean, some examples of artists who have dealt with Walt Whitman beyond this so-called classical music are numerous.
Absolutely.
Billy Joel mentioned Walt Whitman in a song, but you also have many others. So, yeah, Daron, if you could explore for us how in this democratic kind of theme of Walt Whitman's work is more music included in such an archive?
Well, we're all struggling with diversity and inclusiveness and trying to broaden, not only broaden, but hopefully abolish the outmoded gatekeepers who I wouldn't even call them gatekeepers. I would call them people who threw up the boards around the sandbox and said that the sand has to stay behind the boards. I think the sand should be everywhere. And I think we should get the garden hoses out and we should spray the sand and get in there and just jump up and down. Because there's not a lot of time left in history. There never is any time left. And if we're going to have a reason for this wonderful archive to move into the future, it's in the hands of people like the Walt Whitman Birthplace and the Music Collection to aggressively document them by collecting their musical scores. The whole idea of publishers, I can't unpack that either. I mean, I've had big publishers, I've had exclusive agreements, I've had this and the other thing. I don't know what any of that means. Quincy Jones said it best. There's good music and there's the other kind. And if it lands with people, then it's good and it lasts. Whether it has a big publisher or not, might take a little longer. But I think the healthiest thing we're seeing right now is this aggressive, non-guilty, but exciting Whitman-esque plunge toward the margins. Ned used to complain back in the 80s about how, oh, it used to be that we composers complained about being marginalized. Well, now we don't even matter. Well, if Ned was talking that way in the arms of Boozy and Hawks, teaching at the Curtis Institute and living on the Upper West Side of Manhattan in the 1980s, where are we now? I think that we're much further down that road, and I think there can be arts leadership, and it doesn't just have to be us using the Shostakovichian pulpit given to us by the tyrants. It can be through technology, through the ubiquity of reach, that a good setting of Walt Whitman can attain. I know that all sounds very flowery, but I actually believe it.
Thanks, Daron. I think it'd be a great segue now to show the film of the work. And so I'll introduce it by saying it was my honor to be able to film it. It's also really a fun exercise in filmmaking for me, because this is one of those rare cases where something was pulled off. We were able to do something with one continuous moving camera take that was a truly collaborative effort, where we blocked things together and explored a specific space in Rhinebeck, New York, that you'll see in the end credits. But also I note that there are some interesting techniques in this performance and composition. They include polyphony, where a human voice can kind of create multiple layers of notes rather than just a single note in a sound space. And also improvisation. So there are things that are written, and there are things that Gilda, in her amazing virtuosity, explored both the words and the space and the written notes and expanded on them, riffed on them. And so I'll give Daron the last word if he wants to cue this up with any final thoughts, and then we'll play this film. And I will suggest you might want to ride your volume levels. I don't know how it's been so far, but it's a more dynamic type of sound. So on your computer, you might want to play with your volume to be able to hear it. Daron?
Thanks, Paul. It's so hard to do what he did, and it looks so easy. Both of them, the cut is a demonstration of the sort of technical capacity, but also emotional vulnerability that people I love to work with and admire aspire to. Gilda doesn't leave anything on the field here, and she gives us everything. She does everything that Paul says that she did, and she does it within a framework of no judgment and no shame. And I think that that's appropriate for a tribute to Mr. Whitman.
may come back to you. With equal grace, force, fascination, full-blown and splendid, full of the immense sun, action, ambition, laughter. The night follows close with millions of suns and sleep. And sleep, sleep, and sleep, and restoring time.
So I wanted to note that that video is at waltwhitman.org/music. And we'd really appreciate it if you share it with people to spread the word about the archive and to share that, that short film created by Daron Hagen and Jill DeLyons for this occasion with myself. Thank you all for coming, but we ran into overtime, but I'd love to be able to extend if you're willing to stay or if you want to stay. Definitely feel free to opt out and leave if you'd like, but I'd love to discuss with anybody who has some thoughts. I see a few familiar names in particular as participants who I'd love to hear from too, but I just basically love to open it up. If anybody has anything to say either about music and Walt Whitman that hasn't been talked about, that's your favorite, or some comments and insights about what you've heard, love to hear you speak. So you can unmute yourself and just start talking if you like.
Well, that was wonderful. That's what I'd like to say. Thank you.
I saw a message from Rebecca Messer to put a link in the chat, so I'm doing that right now. Thanks.
It was a beautiful presentation. Thank you.
So I wanted to mention that the archive is growing, and George Mallis has, of course, given it such care in continuing to add to it and to maintain it. Also, I saw earlier in chat a mention that there were lots of interns who helped in sorting it out, unpacking it, and so much tribute to them too. And finally, and most importantly, even though there's not like a fancy sort of form or system set up for it yet, I know that the birthplace is beginning now to welcome contributions from anybody who wants to have their work, their musical work added to the database. And I'll hand it over now to Cynthia if she wants to have any concluding words for the evening.
Well, I am speechless, number one, at the discussion that you led, Paul, with Daron, magnificent, intellectual, emotional. I thank you, Daron, for sharing your passion, as we saw, with us tonight, and your comments and your interpretation of Paul Moon's questions was magnificent. And I thank you on behalf of all of us who are here. And I do want to say thank you to Margaret. She put in a Zoom chat to remind us to thank the interns, but Margaret Giardi is our curator and historian who has spearheaded this, in addition to George. So thanks to Margaret, she's in the audience. And thank you to George, certainly, for all that you've done and your persistence in getting the music here. I am just thrilled with this inaugural performance. Paul, your video was like outstanding. I think we all have to have a round of applause. It's magnificent, magnificent.